from. Let's begin with the basics, he says. Pilgrims were a group of separatists who broke away from the Church of England in an effort to return to a more biblically based way of life. They immigrated to Holland, where they enjoyed a greater degree of religious freedom, but faced a host of economic and social difficulties. After about a decade, they returned to England with the resolve to set sail for the New World. And on September 1620, 102 passengers boarded the Mayflower with the hope of finding religious freedom and a better way of life. The 65-day voyage across the strong, tossed Atlantic current was itself very dangerous for the Pilgrims. Nevertheless, feeling God's calling, they pressed forward and sighted Cape Cod on November 19, hundreds of miles north of their original destination of Virginia. The Mayflower dropped anchor at what is now Providence, Massachusetts on November 21st. It was near Provincetown that the 41 men signed the Mayflower Compact, a compact that would soon become the basis for the government in the Plymouth colony and would later greatly influence the formation of the United States government. As they looked out on a gray, windswept coast on a cold November day, many pilgrims must have wondered if it was really God's will for them to relocate to this desolate location. And little did they know that the true test of their resolve was yet to come. The winter was devastating to the men, women, and children who had already traveled so far and sacrificed so much. Poor nutrition, inadequate housing, and unforgiving winter took their toll. Many died. The new year brought more of the same. 8 perished in January, 17 in February. By the time spring descended on the North Atlantic coast, nearly half of the original group was gone. Christopher Jones, the captain of the Mayflower, left the ship anchored in the harbor throughout the winter. He felt so sorry for the settlers, he allowed many of the colony to take refuge in the hull of the ship, since shelter was so scarce and the winter was so fierce. Finally, on April 5th, 1621, he decided he had enough and resolved to return home. Not one of those remaining settlers left with Captain Jones when he set sail that day. Each one of them felt the call of God deep within his and her heart, and as a group, they refused to go back. Now, on December 21st, as I said, they landed at the site of the Plymouth colony. While still on ship, though, the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact. On November 11th, 1620, Governor William Bradford and the leaders upon the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact before setting foot on land. They wanted to acknowledge God's sovereignty in their lives and in the need to obey him. The Mayflower Compact was America's first great constitutional document and is often called the American Covenant. After suffering years of persecution in England and spending the difficult years in exile in the Netherlands, the Pilgrims wanted to establish their colony on biblical principles that they suffered for in Europe. Before they set foot on land, they drew up this covenant with God. They feared launching their colony until there was a recognition of God's sovereignty and their collective need to obey him. Now, what the Mayflower says in part, I'll read. In the name of God, all men, we whose names are underwritten by the grace of God, having undertaken for the glory of God the advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Do by these present solemnly, mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for better ordering and the preservation and the furtherance of the ends foresaid by virtue thereof, to act, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, and to which we promise all due submission and obedience. And God's hand was in it from the beginning. His divine providence and sovereignty. Had they arrived just a few years earlier, they would have been attacked and destroyed by one of the fiercest tribes in the region. However, 3 years earlier, in 1617, the Patuxet tribe had been wiped out by a plague. Not white men, by a plague. The Pilgrims thus landed in one of the few places where they could have survived. So God created a storm that blew them off course to a place they weren't intending to go, but a safe place, because in his providence, the tribe was wiped out. That fierce tribe was wiped out 3 years earlier by a plague. And not only that, there was one survivor of the Patuxet tribe, Squanto. He was kidnapped in 1605, years earlier, by Captain Weymouth, who had taken him to England, where he learned English and was eventually able to return to New England. When he found his tribe had been wiped out by a plague, he lived with the neighboring tribe. When Squanto learned that the Pilgrims were at Plymouth, he came to them and showed them how to plant corn and fertilize with fish. And he also acted as an interpreter. So when you look at things from a Christian worldview, you get quite a different view than the secular historians that don't believe in miracles. They'll try to diminish them by calling them coincidence. There was an article that I'll read a couple portions from. It's from the 2001 Citizen magazine, and the author is Douglas Phillips, and he's president of Vision Forum, a family ministry in San Antonio, Texas. And it's a lengthy article, so I only read some excerpts due to time, but to give you a flavor of what went on then, and you'll see similarities to what's going on today. This is in his words. If you walk fewer than 100 yards from Plymouth Rock and ascend Coles Hill, the magnificent burial ground of the 50 pilgrims who perished during the first cold winter of 1620, you not only will encounter hundreds of demonstrators who gather on the last Thursday of every November to disabuse the memory of the Pilgrim Fathers, but you also can read the new monument plaque that describes the devastating effect of Christianity on North America, the genocide of Native Americans by the Pilgrims, and the importance of treating Thanksgiving as a national day of mourning. Once viewed by poets and politicians as the cradle of American democracy, Plymouth is gradually being transformed. A stunning example of how a few revisionist historians and a small cadre of well-organized political activists can pressure a community into renouncing its heritage. In November of 1999, I unwittingly found myself an observer to one small but significant step toward this transformation. It was the day before Thanksgiving, standing on Coles Hill. I gathered my wife and 4 children around the great stone sarcophagus containing the recovered bones of the Pilgrims who died during that first winter. And just a few yards to my left stood the towering statue erected in 1921 by the Improved Order of the Red Man and dedicated to Massasoit, the great leader of the Wampanoags, protector and preserver of the Pilgrims. It commemorates the famed chieftain who adopted Christian names for his children and who facilitated an unprecedented 50-year treaty of unbroken peace between the local Indian community and the Pilgrim settlement. Governor William Bradford, the Pilgrim leader, explains in Of Plymouth Plantation that they had multiple goals to protect their children from ungodly peer influences to the culture of Holland, to bring the gospel to the native land, to bring the gospel to the natives, and to lay a foundation of multi-generational faithfulness for their children and a future society. Bradford proclaimed that these families were more than willing to sacrifice their lives if necessary, even though they be but a stepping stone for future generations of believers they would never meet. Each of these goals was achieved. Many Indians were converted to Christ. Generations of Pilgrims remained faithful to this vision. The nation was ultimately birthed, its charter documents drawing exclusively from the principles of self-government and freedom under God, communicated by the Mayflower Compact. Well, then he went on. Thanksgiving Day, a day of mourning over an invasion of this continent by thieving murderers. This is what the crowd was saying. Talk about historical schizophrenia. The Pilgrim genocide markers on the exact spot 380 years ago the Pilgrims buried their dead at night are just a few yards from the great stone sarcophagus with the inscription that reads, "Here under the cover of darkness, the fast dwindling company laid their dead, leveling the earth above them, lest the Indians should learn how many of their graves there were." Reader, history records no nobler venture for faith and freedom than that of the Pilgrim band. In weariness and painfulness, in watchings, often in hunger and cold, they laid the foundation of a state wherein every man through countless ages should have liberty to worship God in his own way. May their example inspire thee to do thy part in perpetuating and spreading the lofty ideals of our republic throughout the world. And he went on, they went over, he tried to confront some of the people in a nice way, and to no avail and no success. But he writes in his article, "Not guilty. So, what about the charges of genocide and theft and ill will by the Pilgrims against the natives? The charge that the Pilgrims stole land from the natives is false. First, Pilgrim leaders viewed it as moral and legal obligation to contract for the purchase of the lands with the Wampanoag and with whom they entered into the land deeds and signed covenants. Nothing was stolen. Second, the Indians were happy to enter such covenants because they did not believe that they had the right to own the land. And since Western and biblical concepts of property ownership were not recognized by the local population during the Christian settlement, and in the pantheistic worldview, the Indian culture, the land belonged to everyone and nature itself. The claim that Pilgrims committed genocide against the Indian tribes is false. The precise opposite is true. For more than 50 years, Pilgrims and local Indians lived in a state of equanimity and peace. Because Indian tribes constantly warred with one another, the Pilgrims found themselves on at least one occasion acting in military concert with the Wampanoag in standing against the invading tribes. But such action was in self-defense, a far cry from genocide. The Wampanoag were a confederacy of other tribes.